Chair now recognizes Mr. Emmer from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And to the distinguished panel, thank you for your time. I just have a couple of follow-ups. For Ambassador Edelman, I think you've answered it now. At the beginning, you talked about recommending. You recommended threatening or imposing new sanctions or additional sanctions. From your most recent comments, are you focused now on sanctions in the event these current negotiations are not concluded by the pending deadline?
Yes, sir.
Then if you could do me one more favor, and maybe I'll take this to others, sanctions are only as effective, can only be effective if they are not hollow. In other words, if they have an impact. It really doesn't matter what somebody says, whether they're going to honor it or not. If additional sanctions are imposed, whether now or once the deadline expires, are those sanctions going to be effective? Is that a rhetorical question?
Obviously, Mr. Emmer, it will depend a little bit on what you and your colleagues consider and what you put into the bill and how it's structured. I do think that there is, although I think Ray has written elsewhere that Iran is the most sanctioned country in the world, I do think that there is still room. There are other sectors of the economy that haven't been hit yet. So I think there's still room to turn up the pressure. And I think there are other things we can do, and members of the panel have suggested it. Mr. Sherman, for one, others have. It shouldn't be just economic pressure. I think there ought to be support for democracy movements inside Iran. I think there ought to be broadcasting. I think there is a whole panoply of things we ought to be doing to put the regime on notice that we will oppose it across the board as it seeks to exert its hegemony in the region.
Mr. Einhorn, in the interest of time, I have a different question for you. In the beginning, during your testimony, you indicated that you believe continued strong pressure, but not sanctions, additional sanctions at this point, would be the prudent course of action. But then you went on to say that we have time, that we don't need to act now, and if the current deadline expires, comes and goes, that we still have time. How much time do we have, sir? What do you recommend? Another 6 months?
I wouldn't put any arbitrary time limit on it. All I'm saying is that the current interim arrangement works to our benefit much more than it works for Iran. Their nuclear program is frozen in all meaningful respects. The sanctions are biting very hard. I think if we cannot get the deal we want to get, we can afford to wait. They're under much more pressure
than we are. Sorry to interrupt, but in the interest of time, if the United States, our interest is peace and prosperity, not only in that region, but across the globe, and presumably that's one of the underlying reasons for these negotiations with this regime, what is Iran's incentive for a viable deal?
Their main incentive is to get out from under the sanctions that are crippling their economy. I think that's what brought them to the table.
But, sir,
that's their incentive.
And again, we get limited with time. We've already heard testimony that their policy has not changed. Their goal remains the same, and that is the elimination of Israel and the United States. So getting out from underneath sanctions, again, I'm going to ask you, what's their incentive then is just to bypass any real solutions so that they can accomplish their goal?
We have to, a number of panelists have made this point, they have to have a clear choice. They have to realize that they can't achieve their goal except by agreeing to a deal that meets our requirements.
Well, then let me ask Dr. Takei. Isn't the only way that you can give them a clear choice is if you have some choice? In other words, you either reach an agreement and eliminate the nuclear prospect, or these sanctions will be imposed.
I think at this particular stage, even in aftermath of an agreement, Iran will maintain a nuclear infrastructure of some capability, and after expiration of a period of time, perhaps a decade or so, then is free to move toward industrialization of that capability. So we will have to live with or without an agreement with an Iran with a sizable nuclear infrastructure.
Thank you. I yield back.